So I'm going to talk today about the training to failure debate. I don't know if you hear about this stuff. I don't know if you're as online as I am, if you're on the same, particular online circles that I'm in and so on. This is a debate that happened, I want to say, most recently, probably like a couple years ago. Happens periodically. It is what it is. So essentially the debate is, do you need to train to complete failure to see maximum gains? So this is actually something that has a long and storied tradition running back to Arthur Jones way back in the day. Essentially, he was a proponent of what he called high-intensity training, which is essentially basically that you do just like one set per muscle group and you just did training to complete failure. And the idea was that training to complete failure was so much more effective than training, any distance from failure, that you're going to get way better results than if you're doing, say, many more sets as a result. We have the research. The research shows that that's just not true. There is some benefit to working closer to failure. When you get to failure, that is definitely going to increase your results compared to staying, super far away from failure. If you've got somebody, they pick up a weight that they could do, say, 12 reps on the bench press, they're going to grow more, they're going to build more strength if they go to complete failure at 12 reps versus if they don't go to complete failure at, say, 6 reps. That said, there are some drawbacks to this method, right? So the first is that when you are training to complete failure, this makes it much more difficult to have a really long workout, right? So when you train to complete failure, you're going to see super big decrements in strength by, from the beginning to the end of the workout. Let's say that I'm doing something like 3 or 4 sets of bench press, again with that 12 rep max. First set, 12 reps. Great. Total failure. Second set, maybe 11 reps, 10 reps, okay. Starting to lose some strength. Third set, 8 reps, 9 reps, starting to lose some more strength. By the time you get to the last set, you're able to handle significantly fewer reps than you could before, and it's, more and more difficult because you're just super, you're just super burnt out. You're just really losing strength from set to set. And the psychological difficulty of this is high. I cannot emphasize enough. It's tough. It is difficult to go into a gym, especially with certain lifts, like something like a squat or a deadlift that are very exhausting to begin with, and do something like a set to complete failure. There's also obviously more injury risk, especially if you're talking about something like a bench press or a squat where you could get pinned under the bar. You need to have a spotter, you need to have somebody around. And, when you're talking about people who are super strong to begin with, let's say somebody who can squat, 500 plus pounds, you need more than just a spotter. You need 3, you need 5, you need a bunch of guys. You need specialized equipment to be there so that they can get the bar off you immediately if stuff starts to go wrong and you don't get smushed like a pancake. And then, of course, there's just more risk of injury when you're really pushing things to complete failure. There's more risk that you're going to strain things, that you're going to hurt things, etc. Basically, the single biggest injury I ever got training in the gym was when I was very stupid 10, 15 years ago. I was, doing an overhead press, standing, didn't really know the form very well at the time, tried to do a set to complete failure to squeeze out an additional rep, and I ended up leaning over too far back, popping something in my lower back, and, basically just hurt, my lower body, my back hurt for months afterwards. I had to significantly alter up my training and so on so that it could heal up over time. So, especially if you have potential issues with your form, if you don't know a lift very well, etc., going to complete failure can potentially be dangerous. It can lead to those situations where you put yourself in a compromised situation, trying to squeeze out a rep that you maybe can't complete, maybe can, but you end up hurting yourself or compromising your form in the process. And then another major drawback is that when you are talking about going to complete failure, we have shown evidence that basically it takes longer to recover compared to not training to complete failure. You have a significantly greater recovery cost, and that can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. So when you're talking about, results, yes, the difficulty of it is sometimes correlated with how much you get out of it in terms of the stimulus and response, but sometimes not. And this is one of those cases where it's kind of not. You're getting an outsized response in terms of extra recovery cost without necessarily getting very much additional benefit out of it. And that can be a problem, right? That can be a difficulty when you are talking about somebody who has a very particular training routine like, okay, like I'm training, 5 times a week, 6 times a week. When you get to higher frequencies, you need to be a lot more cautious about your recovery because you need to be recovered by your next workout so that you can get in more volume and keep training and getting more results, right? If I'm doing something where it's like I go into the gym and I do, sets to failure on bench press and I blast my chest so hard that it takes me like 4 or 5 days to recover, and that totally ruins my chest training for the rest of the week, well, that's obviously not optimal, right? Versus something where maybe I train slightly less hard, maybe don't get quite as good of results, but then, okay, I'm back in the gym 2 days later, I can hit things again. Okay, I'm back in the gym 2 days after that, I can hit things again. The benefit of being able to train more, get in more volume, is going to outweigh the benefit you get in terms of the added benefit from, again, training to failure and the associated additional recovery cost. And much more recently, we now have research that is beginning to show that you may not even need to go to complete failure to get the same results. So what that means is, again, going back to the example of the bench press 12 rep max, we know that if you go something like, 6 reps out of 12, probably not going to get as much of results. But if you're talking about something like 10 reps out of 12, 11 reps out of 12, something that is very close to failure but not quite, you're going to get basically the same benefit. Like, you're going to get essentially the same amount of growth, the same amount of strength, and so on. And again, you're going to avoid that drawback in terms of potentially overstressing your body, taking longer to recover, potentially injuring yourself, trying to squeeze out a final rep, and so on. And so, if you're talking about, okay, what is optimal, for most people, it would probably be more optimal to train little bit away from failure, just a little bit. Like, again, to the point where you're really challenging yourself, you're really pushing yourself, but you're not necessarily pushing yourself so hard that it's incurring all those extra negatives. We started having this research coming out, and there started to be a bit of a debate around this, because there are a lot of guys who are purists who really are like, no, you really, really have to train to failure, and there is some reason to their side. So one thing that we do have is that we do also have research that shows that people are pretty bad at knowing how close they are to failure unless they have really trained to failure a lot in the past. And so you take these people who have not necessarily trained to failure, you ask them what they think they might, be able to handle with a particular weight, and they say, oh, I think I could do, 12 reps on a bench press. And then it turns out they could do 15 or they could do 18 or, they could do significantly more than they thought because they're not used to training to failure. And so a pretty common prescription is like, well, people are pretty bad at knowing how close they are to failure. They're potentially leaving gains on the table by not training, closer to failure or to failure. And so an easy way to dummy proof your training program is pretty simple. It's just train to failure. You know if you fail or not. That's a pretty simple standard to test. And so if you've got somebody and they're a beginner, they don't necessarily know what they're doing as well, they don't necessarily know where their limits are, then if you say, hey, do like some sets to failure, then you're ensuring that you know that they're not leaving any gains on the table. They are definitely getting the most possible gains out of their training. So it's kind of dummy proof in that way. And you could even do something a little bit easier and kind of compromise. Maybe you do something like 3 normal sets, but then you do 1 set to failure or a drop set to failure to finish the exercise when you're done. So you would do more like normal training, but then you'd finish your exercise with 1 set to failure. This kind of then ensures like, hey, okay, you're leaving nothing left in the tank. You're really pushing it on that last set. You definitely get the benefits of training to failure there. So that's, again, something you could do. Maybe not as necessarily grueling or taxing as just doing 3 total sets to failure versus doing like 1 final set to failure, right? There started to be a lot of, I would say, passive-aggressive infighting in the fitness industry when a lot of this research came out, in particular about how there is a lot of like, hey, how do we know that the people in these studies are training to failure? How do we know that, these people who are supposedly training to failure are not training in decent ways away from failure, thus they're not really doing true failure, and maybe they're all just, weak and, they don't know what they're doing, and as a result, like, all of this research is suspect, and, all these pencil-pushing nerds don't know what they're talking about, blah, 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 true failure is so much better. And this turns into this huge, no true Scotsman fallacy argument where basically everything on the internet is like, guys who really support the idea of training to true failure being like, no, you're clearly not training to true failure. I know what training to true failure looks like. Here's me training to true failure. It looks totally different than you training to true failure, and blah, 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 blah. And there's a debate out of it. There's no point in having these debates. I would say that, maybe there is some truth to the fact that, again, maybe the researchers are not necessarily training in the best, most controlled conditions. Maybe it's not quite true failure, etc. But I honestly don't care, right? Like, I think that a lot of these people making these criticisms are pretty mean-spirited. They're not necessarily doing it because they really care about the science or they really care about like finding out the true answer. They're just really dedicated to the idea of training to failure. That's their pet thing that they love. And so they're really convinced that, like that's the only way to train. And if you're not training like them, then you're not training the right way, and etc. And I gotta say, like, we've had people on both sides of this throughout history. There are people who have been, huge proponents of Arthur Jones's high-intensity training type theories. Dorian Yates is a pretty prominent one. There have been lots of other bodybuilders who have followed similar stuff. In general, what the research says is that more volume is better than less volume, and that you don't necessarily have to train super, super all the way to failure. You can train a little bit away from failure, still get basically the same benefit. And I would say that, again, there are significant drawbacks to training to complete failure. And so it's certainly not for everybody, right? If it's not for you, it's not for you. You don't have to do it. You can train slightly away from failure, get probably the same results, maybe slightly less results. But in the long run, like, not worth worrying about too much, not worth arguing too much about, not worth getting into a huge fight about. Just is what it is. So that is all for this week's video. As always, don't hesitate to like, comment down below, let me know what you'd like to see in future videos. Subscribe, smash that notification bell. I will see you all next week. Have a good one.